If you are currently leveling up your Django skills with this tutorial is part of a free YouTube playlist. The link to the whole playlist is in the video description. Now, if you love this tutorial and playlist, then you might also like to check out the whole course, Django Database ORM Mastery on Udemy. The link to the course, which should provide the best price, can be found in the video description. As we get deeper into testing, we have been introducing different features from the Pytest testing framework. Now is the turn of Pytest Fixtures, which we will be utilizing to build our test database Docker container. So far, we have conducted a range of tests, which doesn't necessarily need any additional context or resources, such as database connections or configurations. As you get deeper into the testing process, you'll find that there will be a need for you to set up resources and context in preparation to actually then perform a test. So simply put, fixtures are functions that run before and sometimes after your test function to set up these necessary contexts, such as database connections, configurations, or any state your test needs. If you're familiar with the idea of functions in general, then this probably makes sense anyway. Essentially, we're just going to be building functions, blocks of code, which is going to perform some sort of task in preparation to then run a test. Now, typically, you will find in our projects that we use a file called fixtures in our test suite, and in there we will then define the fixtures individually within those files. However, you can place fixtures in Pytest anywhere you like, so you might want to create a fixture within your tests, run some code, and then in order for us to then actually utilize those fixtures, we just need to call the fixture by the function name and pass it in to our test. To build a Pytest fixture, we simply create our function and declarate it with the Pytest fixture declarator. Now, you might be wondering, what's the point of that? Why not just use a basic function and call that in? Well, Pytest fixtures do offer different benefits and advantages over using simple regular functions here in the test suite. So it provides automatic resource management. So the Pytest fixture has built-in mechanisms to handle setup and tear down tasks. So we can utilize yield within the fixture. The code before yield runs the setup phase, and the code after yield will then execute during teardown. And that's going to be useful for our setup when we're building a database or preparing a database for tests, because we can utilize this feature to, once the tests have been completed, then roll back, tear down everything that was built to actually create the database in the first place. Utilizing fixtures also provides us a granular control. We can define the scope of our fixtures to control how often the setup code is executed. So, for example, we can specify that a fixture should run once per test function, once per module, class, or potentially session. And this is going to help us optimize performance and manage resources more effectively. Scope management is something that we should understand and know a little bit more about in Pytest fixtures, because, like I mentioned, this is going to allow us to control how frequently a fixture setup code is executed and when it is destroyed. So there is a default scope if we don't specify a scope for our fixture, and that is function. Simply put, when we define a fixture scope as function, it means that that function is going to be created for each test function that requests it. That, of course, is ideal where each test needs a fresh instance of the fixture, or when the setup is quick and doesn't need to be shared. But of course, once you start thinking about creating a resource which is required for multiple tests, the scope function there is probably not going to be suitable. Now, you may be building your tests within classes, so there is a scope for that. So like the function scope, this just means that the fixture will be created once per test class, and it would then be shared among all the test methods within that class. Similar to module, if we define module, this means that the fixture with model scope is created once per module, so once per file. A module being a file, so test.py, that is one module. So it's going to be shared among all the test functions within that module. Where you will need to create a fixture and have a resource which is going to be shared across all tests, maybe throughout the entire session. So the session being from the first test initializing to the last test finishing, then we can define the session scope as session. So this is going to be really useful for whenever you create a resource that maybe is expensive to create and then can be used or reused across multiple tests. The important thing here is to remember that the default setup or default scope is going to be function. So finally, let's take a look at how we might manage our fixtures within our test. Now, generally, there are two places where we might like to define fixtures. Locally, so within the actual test files, and then we might want to set a fixture to be more global so we can share it across multiple test files. If you were to place your fixture locally within your test file, then there's nothing else you need to do at that point. You can simply just call your fixture and it will be found by Pytest and then utilized within your test. So you can see in this basic example, we've created this local Pytest fixture, and then within our test function, we have included its name as a parameter in our test function. Now, Pytest will automatically call the fixture function and then pass its return value to the test function. To use your fixtures more globally so that we can share across multiple test files, we're going to need to define them in our conftest file. So if you remember, the conftest file is a file that will be initiated when Pytest runs its test. So before Pytest runs its test, it will run the conftest file. So if we define or import our fixtures into the conftest file, that means the fixtures will then be available to be shared across multiple test files. So go back into our tests. Let's remove our local fixture at this point because we've now gone ahead and imported the fixture through the fixtures file from the conftest file. That will now allow us to access this fixture globally from any test. And it's the same process again. We're going to pass the name of the fixture as a parameter into our test function. So that's the basic underpinning knowledge of Pytest fixtures. Everything that we need to know to now get started using Pytest fixtures within our project.